June 25th, 2009. A phone rings in a New York apartment. On the other end, a shaking voice tells Janet Jackson that her brother, the most famous entertainer on planet Earth, has collapsed and isn't breathing. Within hours, the world would be mourning Michael Jackson. But almost nobody stopped to ask what happened to the sister he called Dunk. The one who grew up sharing a bedroom wall with him. The one who defended him when the entire world turned against him. The one who had to bury him, literally, while cameras followed her every move. What came next for Janet Jackson wasn't a single tragedy. It was years of it. A funeral delayed by money disputes. A family fractured by grief and greed. A courtroom she forced herself to sit in, day after day, just to look her brother's killer in the eye. And a career that had already been quietly punished for the crime of loving Michael Jackson in the first place. This is the story most people never heard, what really happened to Janet Jackson after the world lost Michael. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why she says not a single day goes by that she doesn't miss him. To understand how deeply Michael's death shattered Janet, you have to understand what he was to her before it happened. Janet was the youngest of the 9 Jackson children, born into a household where Michael wasn't just a big brother. He was practically a second father figure, despite being only a few years older. While the rest of the world saw the king of pop, Janet grew up seeing something else entirely. A kid who loved cartoons, who was scared of his own father, who found refuge with his little sister because she was one of the only people who never wanted anything from him. That closeness never faded, even as both of their careers exploded into global phenomena. They spoke often. They confided in each other, and in the days before Michael's death, they had one final exchange that Janet would carry with her for the rest of her life. She said publicly that it happened just 2 days before her birthday, a short, ordinary conversation, the kind siblings have 1,000 times without realizing it might be the last one. At the end of the call, she told him she loved him. He said it back, and used the nickname he'd given her years earlier, Dunk, short for a joke about her sturdy, stocky build as a kid that had somehow stuck as an affectionate family nickname for decades. Neither of them knew it would be the final time they'd speak. Just days later, on June 25th, 2009, Janet was going about her life in New York when the call came. Her brother had collapsed at his rented mansion in Holmby Hills, California. Paramedics were performing CPR. Something was very wrong. What followed was the kind of surreal, disorienting shock that doesn't feel real even as it's happening. Janet has described the hours after learning of Michael's death as a blur. Phone calls, flights, family members scrambling to get to Los Angeles, and the horrifying realization that the news was already breaking publicly before the family had even processed it themselves. The world learned Michael Jackson was dead in real time, on television, on the internet, in headlines, the same moment his own sister was still trying to understand if it was true. For most people, grief is private. For Janet Jackson, grief became a spectacle the second it began. Paparazzi camped outside family properties. News vans lined the streets. Every red-rimmed eye, every stumble, every private moment of collapse risked becoming a photograph sold to the highest bidder. She wasn't just losing a brother, she was losing him in public. Over and over again, every time a new detail broke. Here's something most fans don't know. At the exact moment Michael died, Janet was in the middle of filming Tyler Perry's Why Did I Get Married Too? Production didn't stop, and in a strange twist of fate, one of the scenes she had to shoot not long after his death required her character to have an explosive, violent breakdown, smashing up furniture and a house with a golf club, channeling pure, unfiltered rage. Janet has spoken about how that scene became something unexpected, a release valve. She's described throwing herself into it, using the physical act of destruction on camera to let out emotions she couldn't process any other way. The fury, the disbelief, the helplessness of losing someone she couldn't protect. Tyler Perry, who has remained close to Janet for years, has talked about how raw and real that performance felt, because in many ways it wasn't acting anymore. It's a small detail, but it says everything about how Janet chose to survive those first months. She didn't retreat from work, she used it. Grief that had nowhere else to go got poured into a scene that was, ironically, supposed to be fiction. But that catharsis on a film set couldn't erase what was happening off it. because almost immediately, the Jackson family began fracturing under the weight of Michael's death and money. In the hours and days after Michael died, his rented Holmby Hills mansion reportedly became something close to bedlam. Multiple accounts from journalists and authors covering the Jackson family, most notably Randall Sullivan's book Untouchable, The Strange Life and Tragic Death of Michael Jackson, describe a frantic scramble by various family members to get into the house, locate cash, and secure valuables before anyone else could. According to that reporting, even Michael's own mother, Katherine Jackson, then in her late 70s, arrived at the property in the immediate aftermath and began making calls trying to track down where money in the house might be. The picture painted is one of a family in absolute freefall, grieving and grasping at the same time, unable to separate loss from the sudden, chaotic reality of an estate now up for grabs. It's an ugly picture, and it's one the Jackson family has pushed back on over the years. But it set the tone for what was, by most accounts, one of the most contentious periods in the family's already turbulent history. And nowhere did that contention become more public or more damaging to Janet specifically than in the fight over Michael's funeral. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009. He wasn't laid to rest until September 3rd, more than 2 months later. For a public desperate for closure, that delay became its own kind of story, filled with rumor, speculation, and eventually a very specific and very damaging allegation aimed squarely at Janet. In 2012, Sullivan's book, excerpted in Vanity Fair, claimed that Janet had personally put down a deposit, reported at either $40,000 or, according to later records, $49,000, to secure Michael's burial plot at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. The explosive claim was that Janet refused to let the funeral move forward until Michael's estate paid her back. The story spread everywhere, and Janet's team moved fast to shut it down. Her attorney sent a scathing letter to Vanity Fair's editor-in-chief, calling the claim false and defamatory, insisting Janet never delayed the funeral in any way. According to that response, the true sequence of events was the opposite of what was reported. Janet fronted the money herself to make sure her brother could be buried. And it was Michael's estate that reimbursed some of those costs to her the following year, not as a condition of the burial happening at all. Her legal team also noted there were additional private expenses Janet covered that she never asked to be repaid for at all. Vanity Fair, for its part, stood by its reporting, only correcting the dollar figure from $40,000 to $49,000 after records became public, but not retracting the core allegation. Whatever the real timeline was, the delay itself was very real, and it wasn't hard to understand why the public latched onto a villain narrative. Court records at the time confirmed that Jackson's estate, not any one family member, ultimately bore the funeral costs, which were described by an estate attorney as extraordinary, and that 12 burial spaces were purchased at Forest Lawn as part of the arrangements. The funeral, originally planned for August 29th, what would have been Michael's 51st birthday, was pushed back to September 3rd, with no public reason given by the family's spokesperson at the time. For Janet, the damage was already done. Whether or not the allegation was fair, it attached itself to her name during one of the most painful periods of her life, turning private grief into a public accusation of greed, an accusation her legal team spent real time and money trying to erase. While the funeral controversy played out in magazines and gossip columns, a far more serious battle was unfolding in a Los Angeles courtroom, the criminal case against Dr. Conrad Murray, Michael's personal physician. Investigators determined that Michael died from a combination of the powerful surgical anesthetic propofol and sedatives administered by Murray in Michael's own bedroom in an attempt to treat his severe insomnia. The coroner ultimately ruled the death a homicide. Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter. Janet did not stay on the sidelines. In interviews given as the case developed, she was direct and unwavering about where she placed the blame, squarely on Murray, for administering what she and much of the public saw as an inexcusable, ultimately fatal treatment to a man under his direct medical care. She spoke about recognizing that Michael had real struggles, including what she believed was a dependency issue he was in denial about, but she never let that complicate her position on Murray's culpability. In her eyes, a doctor is supposed to protect a patient, not endanger one. More than that, Janet made a decision that a lot of people in her position might not have. She showed up. She and members of the Jackson family attended the difficult pretrial hearings and the trial itself, sitting through hours of clinical, often disturbing testimony about exactly how Michael died. She's described it as an excruciating experience, reliving the worst day of her life in forensic detail over and over, in a room full of cameras and strangers. But she also framed it as something she had no choice about. As blood family, she felt it was their duty to be there, to physically stand united and bear witness, to make sure the world saw that Michael Jackson wasn't just a headline. He was somebody's brother, somebody's son, and his family wanted the world to see them fighting for him. In 2011, Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 4 years, though he ultimately served only 2 before being released on parole due to overcrowding-related credits, and his medical licenses were suspended and later revoked. For Janet and the rest of the family, it was a measure of accountability, but not something that could undo the loss itself. Here's the part of Janet's story that's arguably the most unfair. And it didn't even start after Michael died. It started years before, and it never really stopped. Long before 2009, Michael's life had already been engulfed by scandal, most notably the child molestation allegations that first surfaced in 1993 and resurfaced again in a 2003 case that went to trial in 2005, where he was acquitted. Michael denied the allegations until his death. Janet, in her deeply personal 2022 A&E and Lifetime documentary, simply titled Janet, opened up for the first time about just how much those scandals cost her, not emotionally, but financially and professionally. She revealed that in the early 1990s, she was on the verge of signing what would have been the biggest brand endorsement of her career, a mega-million-dollar deal with Coca-Cola. The company had approached her specifically because her brothers were tied to rival Pepsi, and they wanted Janet as their own major star. Then, the first molestation allegations against Michael broke, and almost instantly, the deal evaporated. According to Janet, Coca-Cola simply pulled out. No lawsuit, no controversy about Janet herself, just a quiet business decision to walk away rather than be anywhere near the Jackson name at that moment. Janet's response, looking back on it in the documentary, was calm but unmistakably weary. She called it what it was, guilt by association. She'd done nothing wrong. She wasn't accused of anything. But her last name alone was enough to make a Fortune 500 company nervous, and that was a price she paid. A price that had nothing to do with her own career or character. She never wavered in defending her brother throughout the ordeal, saying plainly in the documentary that she never believed for a second that he was capable of what he was accused of. She described staying close to him during the worst of it, including spending time at Neverland Ranch simply to be present for him during a period when so much of the world had already convicted him in the court of public opinion. Even projects meant to bring them together caused pain. When Janet appeared in Michael's 1995 music video for Scream, one of the most expensive music videos ever made at the time, she said that instead of it feeling like the reunion she wanted, Michael's team kept the siblings physically separated on set, blocking off areas so she couldn't even watch what he was doing. She's described that experience as hurtful, because she'd shown up specifically to support him, and instead she felt shut out during a moment she'd hoped would feel like old times between them. So by the time Michael actually died in 2009, Janet wasn't grieving a brother in isolation. She was grieving a brother whose name had already cost her real, tangible parts of her own career and public image, and now she'd lost him for good, with no chance left to get back what the association had cost her, or to simply be his sister again without the world watching. More than a decade and a half later, Janet Jackson is still one of the most influential entertainers alive. A rock and roll Hall of Famer, a Kennedy Center honoree, an artist whose influence on pop music and choreography is undeniable. But ask her about Michael, and the years fall away instantly. In multiple interviews since 2009, Janet has said, in various ways, the same essential thing. There isn't a day that goes by where she doesn't think about him. Not the tabloid version of Michael Jackson, not the court case, not the headlines, but her brother. The silly one. The one who made up ridiculous nicknames. The one who called her in the middle of the night just to talk. The one who, according to her, always had her back. The same way she tried to have his. She's talked about how their bond was rooted in something the public rarely saw. Two kids who grew up under enormous pressure, who found safety in each other precisely because neither one wanted anything from the other except the relationship itself. Everyone else in Michael's orbit at various points wanted something: access, money, a piece of the legend. Janet, by her own account, just wanted her brother. That's what makes the aftermath of his death so quietly tragic. Janet didn't just lose Michael Jackson, the cultural icon the whole world mourned for a week and then moved on from. She lost the one person who remembered who she was before any of the fame existed, and she had to do it while fighting off funeral controversies, sitting through a homicide trial, and carrying the professional scars of scandals that were never even hers. She built a life after 2009, she toured, she became a mother for the first time in her late 40s, she released new music, she told her own story on her own terms in that 2022 documentary. But underneath all of it has remained a grief that, by her own description, simply doesn't have an expiration date. Janet Jackson's story after Michael's death isn't really about scandal or lawsuits or funeral disputes, even though all of that happened and all of it was real. At its core, it's a story about what it costs to love someone the whole world has an opinion about, and what it means to keep showing up for that person anyway, in a courtroom, at a burial, in the quiet moments nobody photographs. She didn't get to grieve like most people do. She had to do it in public, under a microscope, while defending her brother's name and her own. And somehow, she's still standing, still making music, still telling her story, still, by her own words, missing him every single day. If this video gave you a deeper understanding of what Janet Jackson went through, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold stories from the world of music and entertainment, and let us know in the comments, what part of Janet's story surprised you the most? We read every single one. Thanks for watching.